Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the next installment in the Grensbach, Gleer & Associates webinar series, Evolving Perspectives on Volunteer Leadership. Today's webinar is co-presented by Martin Grensbach, GGNA Chairman, and Michael Goodwin, President and CEO of the Oregon State University Foundation. Martin has had over 30 years of experience in philanthropic consulting with clients across the nonprofit sector, and Michael Goodwin has had nearly 3 decades of experience in institutional advancement. He is currently leading the campaign for OSU, which is Oregon State's first campus-wide fundraising campaign. Today's session will examine the changing role of volunteers and where we see it heading in the future. Our presenters welcome any questions you have during today's session, and will answer those questions in the time remaining at the end of the hour. To address a question to any of our presenters, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. Select all participants from the drop-down menu and send us your questions. Any questions we do not answer today will be addressed in a follow-up message we send next week. Tomorrow afternoon, we'll send a recording of the session along with the presentation slides, as well as a short survey to gain your feedback. Thanks again for joining us today, and I'll now turn it over to Martin to get us started.
Thank you, Joan, and good afternoon to all of you, and I think good morning to some of you. We're delighted to share our thoughts with regard to volunteerism, particularly in higher education, and where it's headed, and I'm particularly enthusiastic that Mike Goodwin was able to join us. Mike, of course, is a veteran in our profession and has remarkable experience, in particular in being the architect of 3 different campaigns, and he's somewhat unique in that he's been at all of the institutions wherein those campaigns have been executed from beginning to end, and has managed all of those campaigns, and they're all $100 million, billion-dollar size campaigns. So Mike brings a lot of wisdom and judgment to this question that we're addressing today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how we have used volunteers typically and historically, and then we're going to move into an agenda of how we see things are changing and what we think the future looks like in terms of volunteer engagement with our institutions and with our fundraising programs. Having said that, Mike, you have anything you want to offer before we proceed?
Well, Martin, I just thank you for your kind words and acknowledge that you worked with us on all 3 of those campaigns, and it was a great relationship. And I think from our earlier conversations, we're going to focus today largely on working with very senior fundraising committees and fiduciary boards and people who typically have really long-term commitments or engagement with our institutions. And maybe one of the trends we might discuss later is the move to more episodic or project-oriented volunteer involvement, in addition to what we're going to be talking about.
Fair enough. And we'll be making a list, and we'll be getting questions as we proceed, and we can address those as they emerge, as we're seeing them in copy, as well as when we have discussion period at the end of our session. But first, let's set the context of making sure we all share a perspective and an understanding why we like volunteers, all of the things they do for us and with us, particularly from a fundraising point of view. And I have another slide that I haven't put in this deck, why we don't like volunteers, that we can discuss at some length if you would like, because they do create issues and problems and challenges. And I think it's probably true that engaging volunteers in a real and meaningful way increases our workload probably by a factor of 2 or 3 in terms of what we're trying to get done. So we use volunteers and we increase that level of work because we think the product, the result, the value of their engagement is greater than if they weren't included, even though our efficiency goes up rather dramatically in terms of the processes we're trying to execute. But here's a list on page 2 of our slide presentation of many of the things they do for us. They lend credibility and stature. They make possible, certainly, access that is difficult for us to gain otherwise. They assist us in building long-term relationships, and it's hard to overstate how valuable that is in environments where, in many instances, our executive leadership isn't there through the lifetime relationship with a donor or a friend, and that lifetime relationship that donor or friend has with the institution. The constant in those environments, and I can think of a number of institutions where we've worked, where the volunteers have provided a level of continuity and security and confidence to the donor and leadership population to a degree that has allowed them to be successful during periods of very significant and often troublesome change of administrative leadership. So they assist in building and sustaining long-term relationships. They certainly provide perspective and feedback with respect to planning and external priorities, recognizing that institutions are, academic institutions in particular, are pretty inward-looking places, and they tend to think about what they need, not about the impact that they have or might have, and volunteers help us be honest about thinking about the true impact of our institutions and how to express that impact in ways that will garner enthusiastic support.
Hey, Martin, can I comment on that?
You bet, Mike.
Yeah, so I think that in some institutions it's not unusual to find a little bit of a tension between the academic leadership and the volunteer leadership, and I think a really important role we play as advancement leaders is to create a climate that makes it possible for our volunteers and institutional leaders to engage very seriously with one another. And I think that just comes over time by building trust and by talking about serious topics together during our visits and our committee meetings. You know, and I can remember one volunteer very well who could have been a spectacular volunteer leader, but all he did was, or he was best known for complaining about the quality of gin at our social engagements. And as you might imagine, that didn't endear him to the institutional leadership. So when it came to talking about serious topics, they wouldn't take him seriously. So helping the volunteers understand what they need to do and helping the academics understand what they need to do, I think, is a really important part of what the role is that we play.
Well, I could comment on that volunteer, Mike, and
yeah, you probably know who that was. So.
I had a certain sympathy for his point of view. Just let me complete this list. Provide philanthropic leadership. Of course, their gifts are lead gifts in more ways than just the amount, and in more ways than early in any fundraising effort. They are an illustration and a demonstration of the investment-worthy character of the institution, and as such, they represent a remarkable example of people willing to step forward, and hopefully others will follow. They do help us with solicitation. They provide energy, initiative, partnership. They're always our best donors, and statistically this can be demonstrated time and time again across campaigns. You could ask the question, what comes first, the cart or the horse? We're not sure in this respect, but what we do know is when you look at the data, most of our large gifts come from those who have been engaged in a volunteer capacity in that or a prior campaign or prior circumstance within the institution. They elevate the stature of our institutions typically by their own stature. They create and enhance relationships. They're often an important community or peer group, and they are strategic partners that can provide marketing insight, give us candid feedback in building a compelling case for any donor. And again, this speaks to a point I was making earlier, that we don't communicate very well, and we certainly don't do it even though we are investing more and more money in it in terms of brand building. We don't do a very good job of providing a consistent, comprehensive message as to the value and the impact of our institutions. And frankly, our volunteers are constantly reminding us of that and how we need to do better at that. And probably that reminding, though bothersome, is useful because it does help us to try to do this better. Any comment on any of that, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that you made about how they engage with us strategically and sort of provide constructive criticism is really helpful. And from my perspective, one of the ways that they've really helped us the most over the last 20 years is by encouraging us to consider best practices from their businesses and other sectors they might be in, and helping us think about how to apply those in academia or other places in the nonprofit sector. And I remember really well, you were probably at this meeting, I think it was our first campaign report at Georgetown, and I kind of did what I'd always done, which was to give a report on how well we'd done according to our own performance. It was pretty good news because we were starting a campaign and the numbers were up pretty dramatically over the previous years. And then at the end, a trustee who was with one of the firms on Wall Street said, it's a great report, thanks a lot, but it's really useless information to us, because what we really need to know, because what they were so used to looking at was benchmarking data, we need to know how our peer schools are doing. So I think that ability to kind of identify what they're doing in the private sector and bring that in and sort of gently get us to encourage some of those ideas has been a really important contribution that they've made.
And with regard to that point, the whole issue of benchmarking, I think, was driven by our volunteer leadership at the governance level in particular, but also in terms of lead fundraising committees. And of course, that's led to a lot of head scratching and consternation on the part of the industry, because we have such poor data, and we can't do comparable data sets when we're making these benchmarking comparisons without an awful lot of effort and work. And of course, that's been good for firms like ours. But nonetheless, because of their prompting, we've gotten better as an industry with regard to our data, which helps us to understand how well we're doing and how we can do better. So indeed, from an industry-wide point of view, they've made a significant contribution just with regard to that particular feature and technique.
Yeah, and I think they've influenced other things that we'll be talking about later, the way our committee structures are shaped, the way our meetings occur. I think another area they've had very significant influence is compensation, and getting us to think a little bit differently about that, to the point where there was so much going on around that CASE actually changed and updated its policy about 6 months ago on incentive compensation for fundraising. So just, I think a lot of very beneficial impacts over the years. And I know we're going to talk about social media later, but I think that's another, if I could just comment on that now, another area where I'm starting to see some change. When I got started with this, a lot of the way appointments would occur and introductions would occur were pretty traditional, and you'd call somebody up and ask them to arrange a lunch and go down to the club, and that would kind of be how it would work. And we had a great example from our campaign a few years ago that just reflects how this is changing. We had a volunteer in Houston who invited us to go meet with a friend of his in Denver about a campaign gift, and so our president and I just got on the plane to Denver, largely based on faith in this volunteer in Houston. We'd never met this guy. We were going to see in Denver, and so as we landed, our president turned to me and he asked me with kind of a smile on his face, so how's this going to work? What are we really going to do in there? Fortunately, about the same time, I got an email on my BlackBerry from the guy in Houston that said, it showed kind of an email exchange that they'd had, said, Tom, these guys are coming to see you about the campaign. This is a good project. You need to be a part of it. They're going to ask you for $1 million, and you're going to say yes. And so I think that whole part is evolving, and who knows? We may be doing this on Facebook in 10 years.
And of course, that was a good volunteer.
Yeah, great volunteer. Yeah.
Who was helping in every way, including the strategy and including the solicitation.
But I guess the point I'd make is that he doesn't come to a lot of meetings, but he understands what the mission is, and he's really willing to kind of dig into that point you made about making connections and being a spokesperson for the institution.
Yeah. I would also, your comment a few moments ago reminds me of something that I often present upon that I want to at least share today for a moment, and that is this remarkable position that as development professionals, particularly development leadership professionals, that we occupy sitting between the academy and the rest of the world. And I'm not saying the real world, because they're both real worlds, but they're very different worlds. And part of our responsibility and obligation is to interpret one to the other and to, in effect, develop and secure and mature those features in which we can accomplish interests in common across that division that doesn't communicate very well, doesn't understand each other very well, and the role we play is so critical, so profound, and sometimes I don't think we recognize it, and certainly I don't think our academic leadership recognizes it. Interestingly, I think the volunteer leaders recognize it better than the academic leaders.
Martin, that kind of reminds me of a story I've heard you tell before about a dean we both knew from one of your clients up in the Northwest, and kind of how his appreciation and understanding of his role as an academic leader evolved through all of this. I don't know if you were planning to tell that today, but.
Well, feel free.
Well, no, I'm thinking of David, so if you wanted to talk about it.
Well, he was dean of a very large and very complicated college, and the first challenge he had was to realize that, yeah, I guess I want to use volunteers. The second challenge he had was to think about how to organize them in support of the college rather than in support of his departments. And the third really big challenge he had was to how to organize his office so he had time to work with the volunteers and work in development. He sorted through all those challenges and became very active in the campaign, very active in development. And what he discovered by virtue of convening a committee that helped him think about the college and how to communicate the college's strengths and how to talk about the diversity of the college as a strength and the role the college plays in American higher education, American public higher education, what he discovered is his understanding of the college and its value and what it needed to be effective in and how it could get and should get stronger was all significantly enhanced by the volunteer engagement, volunteer participation in helping him think about those things. So it was really a bit of an epiphany on his part, and now he's evangelical in talking about how his program, his college, and ultimately his institution, because now he's a president, have gotten better because of his interface with the public sector, the private sector.
Yeah, and it was really great. We had him come down and with Martin do a seminar for our deans at the start of the campaign, and he talked about the fundraising and how you work with the committees and all of that. But he, as Martin said, he was really evangelical in terms of talking about what a difference it had made in terms of improving his ability to be an effective academic leader, and that was the message that he really wanted to leave with everyone that day.
Okay, we're going to move quickly through a few slides to get to the future. What we have here is data, some data to confirm some of the points we just made, but it's data from the most recent Bank of America Center on Philanthropy study on high net worth individuals, and it demonstrates the point, first of all, that they are very active in terms of their volunteerism, and these high net worth individuals are defined as people with a net worth exclusive of their primary residence of $10 million, and in all likelihood will be giving away more than $100,000 in the relatively near future. Percentage of hours of high net worth individuals volunteered, and notice a good number of them, 39%, volunteered more than 200 hours. So we're making the point here that these high net worth individuals are very active as volunteers, at least by their own reporting. And what they volunteered to, in particular, I think if we're working in some of those categories near the top, and these aren't exclusive categories, so many of them volunteered in more than one sector, but some of them volunteered, significantly in education in particular, which is, I think, a significant majority of our audience today. And then, to help prove a point we made earlier, notice the average giving amounts, total hours volunteered. Those who volunteered the most, and this is in 3 different years, and they gave less, obviously, in 2009, remarkably less than they did in 2005, as self-reported, most in 2007. But the point is, in all 3 of those years, 2005, 2007, 2009, those who volunteered the most gave the most, and those who volunteered the second most gave the second most, with the exception of 2005. So it again proves the point that those with high net worth are interested in volunteering, number one, and number two, the more they volunteer, the more that they give. Any comment on all that data, Mike?
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about this issue later, but I told Martin earlier I had a chance to see much of this data and other slides related to it at a conference last January, and one of the other trends that was discussed that day that's related to this data that I really found very interesting was that the intergenerational wealth transfer that we all heard about a decade or so ago hasn't materialized quite as robustly as was predicted, in fact, quite a bit less robustly. There's still a lot of money being transferred. So one of the theories as to why that's happening is that more and more wealthy people are setting up family foundations and other vehicles as opposed to dedicating their gifts to the institutions. And then one of the theories about why that's happening is that their motivation is to stay engaged with the decisions about how their money is used, and also to be able to engage subsequent generations of children and grandchildren. And that whole conversation just, and I think we're going to come back to this again later, has really had me thinking about, what's going on here, and are we engaging people like this as meaningfully as we possibly can at our institutions? Are the opportunities that we're offering them for volunteer leadership as profound and meaningful as they can be? So I just wanted to raise that and kind of in support an interesting trend that I think we'll talk about again later.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do we do that? How do we engage them, particularly as the responsibility for these assets becomes distributed across a broader community? And sometimes a community, it's hard to predict who it's going to be. Mm-hmm. So it is indeed an interesting phenomena. There's some other data a lot of other data, and I would recommend the study to you. It's available on the high net worth individuals. But one of the slides asked the question of that community: how sophisticated, in effect, do you think you are as a philanthropist? How planful are you? How experienced and effective are you as a philanthropist, relating to this foundation question, family foundation question? And over 70% of them indicated that they felt that they were experienced and sophisticated philanthropists, which certainly has some ramifications about how we choose to engage them to develop philanthropic contributions.
Well, Martin, how would that tie into your experience? And, you meet a lot of people in feasibility studies and the like. I mean, have you seen a transition there over the last many years of doing that sort of work in terms of the sophistication of the people that you're talking to and what they're looking for?
Absolutely. They're more sophisticated. They do much more due diligence. They have higher standards of proof, in effect, before they're willing to make their investment. And they often develop criteria and methodologies to evaluate the investment that are difficult for us to respond to, using outside assessors and that sort of thing. So it's very challenging. It's getting more and more challenging, particularly with this new generation of very large contributors that make these transformational principal size contributions, but continue to have a very active role in the impact and the execution of those contributions. We just developed here a list to close out sort of the context setting that we wanted to do. Typical roles we've asked volunteer leaders to play in the past: certainly planning committees, fundraising action committees, where we ask them to mobilize around leadership and major gifts and unit-based gifts and regional gifts and so forth. We do use them a lot in communications committees, and often a subset of that in kickoff committees, and they provide great value in support of those activities. Increasingly, I think institutions are developing volunteers as very high-level co-hosts, which of course helps co-opt the host volunteer and conscript them in terms of their fundraising role and activity, but also I think is a wonderful way to orient and to cultivate uninitiated high-end potential prospects. We use them to help us present increasingly both to external but also internal audiences about fundraising progress, fundraising activity, and fundraising challenges. We use them increasingly. We need to use them much more because they're wonderful at it in providing personalized and customized stewardship, thanking people in a personal way. They certainly serve as fiduciary. They certainly provide investment management support, neither of which I think we're going to talk about a lot today, but in those environments where they're doing that with us, of course, that's very meaningful for them and I think extraordinarily valuable for us. They provide alumni board participation, alumni board leadership, and increasingly in this day and age, we're using them in an organized manner and a high-end manner rather than a high-value manner in political, trying to garner political leverage with our state legislatures and assist us with state appropriation. So this is all part of what we have been doing historically, and I think, Mike, you might, if you want to comment, please do before we move on and look at what has changed and what we think about the future.
Well, I was just going to say, Martin, on the comment you made about communications, and I think you gave me this idea originally, but it was some of the very best meetings I've ever had with volunteers had to do with review of and critique of various case statements, whether this was in a group setting where it can be a very powerful way to get people to share their perspectives, or sometimes even better one-on-one, where people go through that process. And you can often, when you're talking about a case for support, I think, with a person one-on-one, steer that conversation to being a conversation about what really matters to them, what their passions are in life, if you will. And I think that whole piece of engaging them with communication strategy is particularly important. And were you going to do the ideal volunteer partner slide too?
Yeah.
Okay.
I got a little bit of that. And of course, they love that engagement with the communication. A good number of them have a lot of experience in marketing, but it's very difficult to manage them in that process. And of course, everybody's a pretty solid critic. I mean, we see really high-quality communications from every channel on a daily basis. So they are an informed audience, in particular with regard to that aspect of our execution of our fundraising and communications programs. So it's challenging, but they are informed and they like to do it. Just a few more thoughts about volunteers and what we're looking for. Certainly, we want them to be passionate. We want them to care a lot about the institution if we're going to use them. And of course, there's ways to test their passion by asking them to do things for us and see how they execute, whether it's presentation or whether it's cultivation or strategy development. We want them to be able to make the case for the institution, and we want them to not only make the case for the institution, but also the case for philanthropy, why philanthropy provides a margin which is extraordinarily important. We certainly want them to be a leadership donor, and all of us on this call recognize the essentiality of that feature if they're going to be effective volunteers. We like them to be patient and collaborative with us, and I think it's an essential, actually, because volunteers on their own will not and cannot be effective. A full partner who take initiative, follow through, bring insight and personal leadership to every task, and I think we look for leadership from them. They need to get up in front of their peers and discuss and describe and ultimately advocate what is good for the institution and why it's important for them and their peers. We want them to be able to use business plans that define fundraising process and clarify goals, emphasize discrete tasks rather than generic roles, so that they're good managers as well as leaders. We want them to communicate directly, follow through, and always tell the truth. And I know, Mike, your volunteers have always demonstrated all of these characteristics.
Well, except for that gentleman I mentioned earlier who wasn't patient about our gin selection, so there was that case. But just a couple of thoughts that triggered, Martin. One is, you know, the spokesperson role and kind of how that's evolved, at least in my experience of it over the years, and I know everybody's experience is somewhat different, but so this may be more a reflection of how I've changed rather than an industry trend, but I was much more oriented earlier on in doing this to the idea of sort of propping up volunteers with scripts and talking points and working with them to have those types of materials than I was on focusing on working with them to make sure that they'd internalize the case well enough that they could talk about it in terms of their own experience. So we've really made a shift that way, and I find myself often, if we're thinking about recruiting someone who might go into one of these public face roles, really thinking about trying to find an opportunity to see them in action a few times so you can see how they communicate, how do they form ideas, do they come across as authentic, are they able to transfer the institutional experience kind of into their own experience. And then another thought on that.
So, Mike, let me interrupt you a second.
Yeah, please. I'm sorry. I don't mean to go on.
No. I'm eager to hear your next point, but then are you suggesting that informally anyway you actually test volunteers before you finally recruit them?
Well, I try to. I mean, I don't know that they don't know this is going on, but we really look for opportunities to, you know, if we're interested in someone for a particular role that is going to have a lot of public responsibility for speaking and talking about the campaign, talking about the university, we'll really try to find those opportunities where, or even create those opportunities where they can talk so we can just kind of see how it goes and what they would be like to work with. And what I guess the other point was I'm increasingly amazed at how hard some of these volunteers will work at this. Like as you know, I've become pretty good friends with one of our campaign co-chairs outside of work, and so I've been in his office many times, like on the Friday afternoon, let's say before an event that's going to occur Friday night, where he is really working and reworking what he's going to say and thinking about it, asking questions about it. And that's pretty much been a common experience with all of the campaign spokespeople that we have. It's just, if you take the leap of getting them away from the talking points and the scripts, it's amazing sometimes what they can do on their own. And they have to have, of course, the message context and the message platform and understand the context that they're doing it within. We're not turning them totally loose, but it's really powerful stuff when it comes out of their hearts.
Mike, you made a comment that I want you to be thinking about a response to a question I'm about to ask you, but not to deal with right now. And I know there's some other people on this call who might have some thoughts as well, but we have always, in our business, I think appropriately taken the position that our volunteers and our donors are not our friends. We work for them and we support them in executing important work in support of the institution that pays our salary and that we care a lot about typically. But you suggested, and I think it's true, that a long-time lead staff person often develops relationships that are maybe evolve into true friendships. And I was wondering how you navigate those issues and what you think is a level of relationship that's acceptable given our role with the universities and what we have to do with these volunteers. And is there some point where you can't get too friendly with your volunteers because that doesn't allow you to do your job? That's all in the form of a question. I don't want you to respond to it yet.
I'll look forward for your cue later, but can I make one other comment on the last slide that you had, though, before we move on?
You bet.
And that's about the point that you made about volunteers functioning as leaders relative to other volunteers. And in my experience, this is what really distinguishes the handful of volunteers who become truly great volunteers. These are the people that will that understand what you're trying to accomplish and will stand up at the right moment, at the tough moment, and say what needs to be said, whether it's, in some cases it needs to be said to the other volunteers. Not always. Sometimes it can need to be said to the institution as well. And I think of one episode that happened in our campaign here where one person during we've all been working with term limits and how long can people stay on our boards, and I think we'll talk about that later, but we were having a tough conversation about that, and we'd had many people who'd been on the board for a very long period of time and didn't see any reason why that should stay. But when this one person had internalized the argument to the point where she could get up and say, I've heard enough about best practices, I think this is the right thing to do if we really want to become the best institution and the best board that we can be. That was the end of the conversation, frankly. And so that ability to kind of work with and try to find and cultivate volunteers who are going to be able to step up at those moments and do those kinds of things for you, often without you prompting them to do it, is, I think, really a key part of what's changed over the years, too. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
No, I would, and I think in the course particularly of every campaign and every campaign planning period, there's a moment where some hard decisions have to be made about goal and timetable. Sometimes there's a bit of a leap of faith where the right volunteer is extraordinarily helpful in bringing the entire group along in their appreciation, their enthusiasm for the project, and their confidence that you're going to be successful. Whereas the wrong volunteer, but one who has a lot of sway with that community, can do just the opposite. They can discourage the entire enterprise and become a self-fulfilling voice.
Exactly.
So we wanted to dwell a bit longer, believe it or not, on some of the things that we see that have changed over the last 20 years anyway. And let me begin with a few points, one of which is chair structure. 20, 30 years ago in this business, we routinely had a chair, and it was a singular chair. It was a man, and it was usually the CEO of the largest locally owned bank, and all of the locally owned banks, all of the banks were locally owned, or at least you could still find one that was very large that was locally owned and very, very influential. And it was part of the social responsibility as well as community role that these individuals played, who had generally a lifetime relationship with their employer, that they would fulfill this chairmanship of a campaign for an institution of extraordinary importance and value to the community. This has changed rather dramatically, and I think it's changed for a number of reasons, one of which is campaigns have become much larger and much more complicated and have many, many more features and moving parts to them, both much greater segmentation in terms of the projects they're looking to fund, as well as much greater dollar diversity, programmatic diversity, many more committees typically within their structure. I think it's also changed this nature of the campaign chair, because it's hard to find that leader, and that relates to the second point, the type of leader we're talking about. Those locally owned banks don't exist anymore except in a few communities, and where they do exist, they really don't have a local or even regional emphasis. They're world entities, and they, by their own observations, say, but our job is not to serve this community. Our job is to serve our shareholders and our depositors throughout the world, certainly, or at least throughout the United States. And in addition, corporate America has primarily gone to professional managers whose singular goal in life is to enhance shareholder value and who are in their jobs for a relatively brief period of time. So tapping that resource of corporate America CEOship is no longer available to us in leading these campaigns. So we've had to go to other kinds of leaders, typically smaller corporations, retired CEOs who made a commitment to remain in the region, who made a commitment to support the institution. Any comment on that so far, Mike?
No, I mean, I just would agree with you very much. I think, many of us in the profession were envious of the University of Washington when they selected Bill Gates Sr. to be their campaign chair, and, he was just like a perfect classical choice, not only because he's Bill Gates' father, but because of his history and stature in the Seattle community. But, most of us, frankly, are just not going to have that type of ideal person. And so, as you know, we've gone to kind of a tri-chairship, which enabled us to pull someone from the finance community, someone from the real estate community, and someone from the food manufacturing sector. And we've just found, as you know, Martin, that that's worked very well for us in terms of the broad coverage, the different personalities, the different perspectives. And as you said, these campaigns are so long that you're not going to always get the chair at every single committee meeting. And so to have that ability to interchange chairs has really been useful.
And another phenomenon that I think is emerging, and see it over and over again, not only are there multiple chairs, but often it's a husband and wife responsibility, and there's a defined role for a spouse. And the leadership structure is increasingly inclusive of both as part of the co-chair community. So you might have 3 co-chair couples, as we do, for example, at the University of Kansas, and all the couples, husband and wife, are very effective and very active in promoting the campaign. It certainly complicates the challenge of supporting the chair and figuring out who's going to manage what aspects of your meetings and so forth. But at the same time, I think it leverages the strengths across those communities. It makes for, I think, a spousal appreciation and joint or mutual support of the campaign agenda, which makes both of them more effective than if they were going to be on their own. I think another phenomena that's identified here, the issue of tenure, it's uncommon in my experience to have active leadership chairs that last the whole tenure of these campaigns. When they now last even 8 and 9 years, and if there's a planning phase in front of that, it's upwards of 10 years. So it's not uncommon to see a shift in responsibility from one co-chair to another, and sometimes the recruitment of a chair that's anticipated or a co-chair that's anticipated will be our second half chair as part of our campaign strategy or our campaign planning.
Yeah, I think that issue of the tenure of volunteers is really an important one, and especially in terms of fiduciary boards, maybe not so much campaign committees, but I think there's really been a shift towards shorter time periods of service, term limits. This is even an issue that's coming under scrutiny by attorneys general and the IRS. There's a case I've heard of in New Jersey where there was a small private school where the attorney general discovered that the university president was paid an outlandish sum of money relative to other presidents. And this kind of relates to your earlier question about getting too cozy with volunteers, because as they pulled back the layers, they found that the chair of that board had been there for 30 years. The president and the chair had gotten to know each other really well, and there was basically no transparency or no process for setting the president's compensation. The board chair basically just did that. So a lot of changes kind of along those lines.
Yeah, and no check and balance.
And if I could just follow up on that, Martin, I think, I don't know how universal this experience is. It would be interesting if we could get other perspectives on this, but I think there was a real sea change for us anyway after Enron and after the legislation that followed that, the Sarbanes-Oxley bill, which of course doesn't apply to us directly, but so many volunteers were impacted by it and then brought those concepts to our organization. And kind of tied to that, I've seen volunteers become much, who knew what a dashboard report was 10 years ago? So they've become much more interested in understanding what the drivers of success are in our organizations and making sure that they have access to information, hence dashboards that enable them to be able to keep on top of that.
And as a result, as I was conveying earlier with regard to our benchmark conversation, we've become much more accountable at providing them good data and good reports. And to some extent, the universities are becoming more accountable in terms of describing the impact of those institutions, some of the decisions they're making with regard to their strategy and plan, enrollment, graduate programs, and so forth, than they've ever been before.
Yeah, and it's really been hard for us to wrestle with issues like how do we provide that, and I think, the next generation of our leadership in this profession might have more actual training in that type of background, MBAs and that type of thing, but it's really been an interesting and I think profound change for us.
Yeah, I would agree. So our final comment leads to a few more slides here, and that is the way that volunteers have worked for us has changed. It's not just their age or their gender or the structure that we use them, but the actual way that we do the work is different. And we've got a few slides that we want to share with you in that respect.
Yeah, so I'll take the lead on these and Martin jump in, but as we talked about earlier, Martin and I have worked up together on 3 campaigns. And so we were reflecting a little bit on how the whole campaign meeting structure, the agendas and so forth have changed, and we wanted to reflect a little bit on that, not so much as to say that what we're doing now is necessarily right or better, although I will say that from my perspective, I do like it a lot better, and I think it's a lot more effective. But looking back, you can see that the old committee model was typically pretty large. I mean, it might be as many as 35, even 40 people. In one case, it tended to be representational. We tended to think about it almost like you do in thinking about an academic search committee. We've got to have this constituency represented and that constituency, and as a result, that led to a lot of inconsistent application of gift standards. I have to confess, if we needed a representative from an area and wanted to get a person we thought could be good, but they couldn't meet the $1 million gift standard or whatever it was, we would tend to fudge on those standards. And then the meetings themselves tended to be oriented, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, towards sending information to the volunteers, receiving reports. And I'd say the new committee model that we've evolved is much smaller. Our current campaign has, I think, 12 people on it, including 9 volunteers and 3 people who are ex officio, including myself, our provost, and our president. Every person on there was strategically selected and recruited, and by strategic I mean that they might represent a type of business expertise that we want, or perspective, or they might have the ability to access a particular community, for example. We didn't get this person, but we wanted very badly to have someone who would be highly visible in Silicon Valley among our graduates down there. Because the committee is smaller and strategically targeted, we found that we were able to be much more consistent in applying that gift standard, and it really made a difference. I mean, one of the volunteers who's been most effective for us really had to stretch to meet that gift standard. And what made the day for him was when he learned he was going to be on a committee of 9 people. He was one of that small of a group that was chosen to represent all of our alumni base. And if we'd been in there saying, you know, you're going to be one of 40 people, I'm not sure that he would have done that. Do you want to add anything to that, or should I just go on to the next
Well, let me ask you a question.
slide?
Give me an example of some of the strategic problem solving that they do.
Well, an example would be, and this leads to a point I want to talk about a little bit, is not some of the best meetings we have are when we're transparent and we share with them things that aren't going well. So at the midpoint of our campaign, we discovered that we were doing well in most areas, but we were not raising as much money for faculty support as we wanted to. So we put all of that on the table, brought in some academics to talk a little bit about that, and spent quite a bit of time talking with them about what we thought were some of the challenges, where we thought the problems were coming from. We got their perspective on it. And over a period, I think, of a couple meetings, we ended up evolving sort of, I mean, it's not especially a unique idea, but it really has worked for us. It's called a Provost challenge, where they were able to persuade the Provost, because he was a part of these conversations, to come up with a pool of money to match donor gifts. And essentially the way it was done is to provide a great deal of incentive to the deans to bring these gifts in. And it's amazing how responsive the deans have been to having that incentive. So just putting those kinds of things on the table where you're struggling, and you know, I guess another example of what would be much different is planning for things like the campaign message platform and the communication. Excuse me. You know, in earlier campaigns with those large committees, we might have had one committee meeting where we devoted an hour to talking about the message platform, or maybe what the plan was for the campaign kickoff. But in this case, we talked about it at the committee meetings, and then because the conversation was so engaging, we actually had a few volunteers from the steering committee that wanted to engage more deeply. So we put together a task force that worked over a period of, I want to say, 6 to 9 months, really got engaged with our staff and the consultants on talking about just how to put it together and critiquing our efforts. So I think there's been really a shift from sort of those large meetings where you do a lot of reporting and maybe a little dialogue, to much more active, proactive engagement. Have you seen that?
I've seen it in some places, and others I think we're still with the large meetings where there's a lot of presentation. Let me ask you a question. Which is harder to staff?
Well, you know, in some ways it's harder to staff the smaller one, because it does take more effort to, you really have to work with people and think about what are the topics that are going to engage, and then if the conversation leads to a whole different process to, let's say, work on the case statement than you had in mind, that's going to be much more work. But at the end of the day, I really find that a lot better than what would happen in the old model, where people would come and they might feel that they weren't sufficiently engaged. Attendance would drop off. You know, you might have people attending episodically or periodically, and so you'd have to spend a lot of time at meetings catching them up. And so even though it's more work on the front end, I think it's more strategic work with the smaller and more proactive committee.
Go long on this.
Can I add one other thought on that, Martin? I want to come back to something else I said, which, you know, I just think one of the things that I've learned over all the time that we've been doing this is how important it is to be transparent with the things you're struggling with. And I gave an example of that. And I think the really best volunteers absolutely hate meetings where all they hear about is what's going well. I mean, they want things to go well. They want to have enough information to be able to understand that and see the indicators. But they know from running their own businesses and enterprises that things are not always going to go well, and they really want to know and understand what the threats and the risks are. And I think that's where, frankly, we're having our best conversations with them, is if we can go in and say, we wish we had better news to report here, but here's what's really happening, and can you help us with it?
Right. They get very skeptical. They get skeptical on the programmatic side when we say we're one of the best this, that, or the other programs in the country when we're not. They want us to make a strong case, but they want us to make a realistic case as well and talk about our unique contributions and strengths.
One other comment I might make on this is just, you know our president well, and I think he really set a tone for our campaign. He'd been through campaigns at other places, and he said, look, I'm not really that interested in how much money we raise at the end of the day. What I really want to know is that going into this, we all see this as a to-do list, that if we agree to the projects on this list, we're all committed to getting that done. And I think the volunteers really fed off of that sort of energy, and it's kept all of us really focused. So I don't know if you'd want to comment on that or not, but.
No, I think that's true. I also think because of the dynamic with the president, the provost, your staff, and the volunteers, the president was able to do some things with the university that he otherwise would not have been able to do. And what I'm thinking of in that respect, and it's a profound change, is the reorganization of the university into divisions. You want to comment on that?
No, I mean, I think that's what you said is well said and describes it well, but it has given him an ability to communicate very strongly and very effectively with them about the direction of the university and what we need to focus on and how we're going to measure success.
Okay, we've got just a few more minutes, Mike, so we got to move to the aligning slide, which I think you probably want to handle, and then you and I can lecture about the future. And I want to come back to at least one question, as you know.
Yeah, I'm hoping we'll run out of time on that. So, I'll just mention that I think there's I could comment on these at length, but in the interest of time, I might just comment, especially on that first bullet up there, asking the question, what do you really need volunteers to do? And I think this is a change because in the past we would develop kind of boilerplate, frankly, job descriptions for volunteers and take them out a job description that said, we need you to do things like attend meetings, give a gift, serve as a spokesperson, be an ambassador, or whatever it was. And increasingly, in the last 5 years, I find people will go through that and they'll look at me and they'll say, yeah, I know all of that, but what I really want to know is what am I going to do and where am I going to add value? And we're just, it's part tied into that thing about Sarbanes-Oxley, but I think another of our volunteers had a great way to say it, that the really good volunteers are people who realize that you can always make more money, but you can never make more time. And they just want to make sure that the time that they're spending is really having an impact. So other than that, I think the rest of those questions kind of speak for themselves, and we could probably move on.
Yeah, but the part of the one comment I'd make about those questions is one of the insights we've come to with regard to volunteers is even though we develop a job description and a menu of responsibilities they're going to have, none of them fulfill all that menu. And from a staffing point of view, and we have staffing patterns on here as one of our topics, from a staffing point of view, I think we've evolved to primarily staffing volunteers on an individualized and customized basis. So we expect each one of them to do something a little bit different, and we need to communicate how that is different and what we expect of them in an ongoing manner.
Yeah, and that's not always an easy question to answer. I mean, you really have to give it some thought ahead of time, and part of it can be a conversation with them about what they might be effective at.
Right. And some of them, we just want their gift, and that's a bit problematic. So here's a list of, we can come back to that too. Here's a list of topics that we might develop, Mike, in the last few minutes that we have, as well as a couple questions that have come in if we have time. But I think we've talked about volunteer tenure. I think there's a couple on here that are particularly intriguing, to me anyway. Family Foundation, social media, principal gifts in particular, and mission engagement. I guess that's more than a couple. Do you want to kick off any of those, or you want me to?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, and I'll just piggyback.
Well, let me talk first about social media, only to say that, it's an extraordinary channel, and I don't think higher education has it figured out. I think it does represent some opportunity that no other channel represents. First of all, in terms of its immediacy and our ability to communicate extraordinarily quickly, and secondly, in terms of its interactive nature. Now, having said that, I suppose I don't sound too wise saying it's a considerable element of our future, but we haven't figured it out. It's not that we haven't tried, and we do have some clients who have put together some pretty elaborate social media organizations for fundraising, and frankly, they've been miserable failures. So I have yet in our experience to see where social media has been capitalized upon by our clientele to be more or increasingly effective in fundraising, which isn't to say that they don't use social channels and the internet to raise some money, but not very much and not in a very profound way, in my experience.
Yeah, I agree with that, Martin. I mean, I think I had kind of a fun experience with this the other night when the news came in about bin Laden, and I was watching 60 Minutes and talking to our daughter on the telephone, and so I said, Kelly, have you heard this is what's happened? And she said, oh, Dad, that's old news. I heard about it on Twitter and Facebook an hour ago. So it's amazing how powerful and how almost universally present it is, especially among the younger generations. Our advancement team did a survey of our graduates, and among the 18 to 24-year-olds, social media were by far the preferred methodology for getting news and information. And some people may know that Oregon State's had a pretty good push called Powered by Orange in the social media area. I'd invite people to check out that website. And I think one of the things that it's done is that they figured out is how to get people to sign up and be followers. But what we haven't figured out yet is the piece about how do we capitalize on that? How do we staff for it? I think, one of the things that was so effective in the Obama campaign is that they could capture that information and then translate it into action in neighborhoods and that type of thing where people would actually go out and host receptions or talk to their neighbors about the campaign. And we just haven't figured out how to do that yet. But I do think we need to keep our eye focused on it because it will be the future for many of us.
It's certainly a component of the future.
Yeah.
We have very limited time, and I want to give you a chance to talk about any of these topics you're passionate about, Mike, or I will proceed if you don't want to. I know you want to talk a bit about family foundations, for example.
Well, I did just want to raise that question, and I raised the question earlier, but it again has me thinking about, if we had someone in our constituency, as many of us do, who could give us $100 million, $500 million, or billions of dollars, and we were going to start the planning process for the next campaign, how would we engage them in a way that would optimize their potential to contribute to that and cause them to be less inclined to want to set up a family foundation and more inclined to go all in with us? And obviously there's issues there about how can they influence academic policy and direction, but at the same time I think there's a lot for us to think about in terms of how can we go beyond kind of our traditional models, which have involved creating a strategic plan, maybe vetting it a little bit, maybe having a prospectus and a case statement process and getting the feedback that way, but really getting those mega donors involved at the early end of our planning processes. And, I wish I knew the answers to that. I just think it's a really important question for us. I don't know if you would agree with that, Martin.
Absolutely. And if you look at Family Foundation's principal gifts, mission engagement, I think there's a message across these topics that our future donors, and not just at the very highest level, but we're paying attention to it at the very highest level right now, are going to want a level of engagement that we have never experienced before. And it's going to be a level of engagement that isn't only with our development staff and our alumni staff, but they want a level of engagement with our faculty and maybe with our students, and to have an ongoing relationship with the institution's execution of the mission, not from the sidelines, but from as a participant, as a partner. And that's something, first of all, our institutions have to get their arms around philosophically, but then secondly, how do we facilitate that and how do we staff it? Clearly we're not well-staffed now to work this out. We don't know how to do this, number one. Number two, we don't nearly have the staffing numbers. But I think it's a trend that's around the corner. I think institutions are increasingly talking about a lifetime of engagement and structured engagement with the institution that isn't around fundraising. That's around a broader and deeper level of involvement and activity.
Yeah,
and how to figure that out, support it, is our challenge.
Can I keep going for one more comment?
Yeah, I'm done.
Which is, I know we're late, short on time, but I just, to really agree with that, and I think how we engage with our campus partners like alumni and in cases like ours, athletics, where that draws a lot of people to the campus, is to do some of those kinds of things that have traditionally been done out of development. I just, coincidentally, Bill Reynolds, the alumni director or executive at Georgetown, is visiting us over the last couple of days, and we got into a conversation last night about something they've done that I just thought was a wonderful idea. It involved going through their database and identifying a number of alumni who've gone on to very significant positions in society or government, and then they put together a project to actually go out and interview these people on videotape with a consistent set of questions about what the Georgetown experience meant to them. And I just thought, you know, not only do they have a treasure trove of material there now to use, but what a profound way that was coming out of the Alumni Association to really deeply cultivate those donors. And in some cases, they got to people, my understanding is, that hadn't been engaged through the typical development process. So I think really thinking outside the box on those things as we go forward is going to be important.
We have a client who has now a campaign goal in dollars and also an equivalent value campaign goal in engagement. And the engagement does not have to be in the campaign. It's just how are we going to increase engagement as one of their goals. We're running obviously beyond time, and I know virtually everybody, including me, wants to hear you respond to that question, Mike. Do you think you can do it with brevity, or do you want to email it to the community?
Well, I'll say a couple of things with brevity, and then maybe add more in the email. But first of all, you're absolutely right. I think it is something to be very cautious about. I think in a situation like ours where we have ethical standards and that sort of thing, that's one layer of protection. For example, if I was receiving a lot of personal benefits from this person, I think that would be clearly outside the realm of what would be acceptable. So kind of a pay-as-you-go, or in the case of this particular friendship, a reciprocation where they might invite us to do something and then we would invite them to do something, and distinguishing between when that should be on your own nickel as opposed to something that's an official event that the institution might pay for. So those are some thoughts, and I think also just having, again, good governance practices so that if you do happen to become close to someone who's in a leadership position, you know, knowing that they're not going to be there for 30 years, knowing that your review and your salary are going to be determined through kind of a transparent process with the board. Those are really some of the factors I'd point to.
Do you think that your ability to ask for money from these people is compromised by your relationship?
You know, there's always that possibility, but I think it's something that you have to guard against, be aware of, and not give into, basically. And, you know, as I said at the outset, these are few and far between. There's a lot of people that you're friendly with, but they're more in the vein of just good, strong business relationships. So I think if I found myself having a lot of personal friendships with volunteers, I'd have to ask myself, why is that happening? And
yeah, it's sort of who you would choose to go on vacation with.
Right, right.
With that, Joan, I think we have to cut this off, but you want to close for us? Thanks, Mike, very much.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks, Martin, and sorry for running over. But we have a couple of questions, but in the interest of time, we're going to email the responses to all the registrants next week in a follow-up. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to submit them to us via the chat box, and Mike and Martin will address them. And also as a reminder, tomorrow afternoon we'll be sending a recording of the session along with the presentation slides. and a short survey to get your feedback. And thank you so much for joining us today.